Okay, so Magnus starts off with this pawn on the wing, stepping away from mainstream theory. For those of you that don't know, what's usually expected in an opening chess game is an attempt to get control of the center of the board, but Magnus completely goes against this. Arrogantly, some might say. It's almost like a psychological move, inviting Yuniesky into unfamiliar territory. But Yuniesky responds with the solid and conventional d5, maintaining classical chess principles. Carlsen doubles down on his unconventional play, pushing out the pawn on the other wing to h4, aiming to disrupt the kingside structure early on. But again, Yuniesky keeps it conventional and develops his bishop to f5, a standard development move, taking control of the center squares. Carlsen finally releases a center pawn with e3, and Yuniesky responds with e6, which, to be frank, is a straight up blunder. This blocks any escape paths for his bishop. You'll see what I'm talking about in a second. Magnus, like a shark, let's say hunting for the next 3-course meal or something, smells blood and seconds later plays the aggressive g4, challenging the bishop straight away. And now it's clear that the bishop is moments away from being taken out and trapped by these pawns. If he moves the bishop back to g6, then the follow-up for white is a pawn to h5. And if he plays the bishop to e4, then white should proceed with c3. So Yuniesky doesn't retreat, but goes ahead and centralizes his bishop with bishop to e4 anyway. A last-ditch attack before it's inevitably taken out of the game. And Carlsen seals the deal with the final challenge of the bishop. Yuniesky essentially concedes here, but starts his own attack with bishop to e7. Carlsen goes on to capture the bishop in the center, and Yuniesky counters with a check boom, taking advantage of the h-file and Carlsen's exposed king. And at this point, positionally, the board looks like a game played by 2 random beginners, not 2 grandmasters, man. But believe it or not, there's more chaos to come. Carlsen moves his king to e2, and Yuniesky finally captures the pawn hanging on e4. And after using about 10 seconds of his thinking time, Carlsen decides to develop his knight, attacking the central advanced pawn. And Yuniesky says, you know what? Not only am I going to defend that pawn, but I'm going to go right after your kingside weaknesses with the bold and brave f5. Carlsen now continues action in the center to try and undermine black's strong pawn on e4, and now Yuniesky smells blood of his own with an aggressive queen move to g5. The hunted has now become the hunter, eyeing Carlsen's weakened kingside and adding even more pressure on that side. Carlsen decides to open the center, perhaps to activate his pieces, but Yuniesky doesn't retaliate directly and decides to capture the pawn on g4 instead, further opening lines towards Carlsen's king. Now Carlsen advances his pawn, likely with the intention of threatening a discovered bishop attack on the queen at some point. Yuniesky continues development with knight to c6, seemingly going after the central pawn that Carlsen just advanced. And it's worth noting here that there isn't actually anything Carlsen can do to defend it, even if he wanted to. But Carlsen, playing like Carlsen, probably doesn't care about the lone pawn right now, and so it's left hanging. Carlsen goes on to develop his bishop, eyeing the long diagonal and supporting the center. Yuniesky continues developing with knight to e7, flirting with the idea of castling kingside, right? Carlsen aggressively brings his knight into a center square, attacking the queen, but Yuniesky, with a deft touch, simply drops his queen to h5, applying the psychological pressure of a potential discovered queen attack at some point. Now, get ready for this next move from Magnus, and take note of what Stockfish, one of the best chess calculator engines in the world for those of you that don't know, take note of what the engine thinks of the move. At the moment, this bar is roughly in the middle, so the analysis engine reckons that these two are roughly equal, but then Carlsen plays his knight to f3, and straight away you see Carlsen's power drain on the analysis bar, because that, my friends, was a blunder. I mean, Magnus had used up a lot of thinking time at this point, so maybe he was hoping that the move might throw Yuniesky into chaos, but it didn't. Yuniesky stayed steady and did the right and logical move here and took the knight with his pawn check. Carlsen recaptures with the bishop, but as you can see, the power bar barely moves here as Yuniesky's queen moves back to h6. And then Carlsen comes in with even more chaos and plays knight to f6. Another bold attempt to disrupt Yuniesky's conventional play, but not today. Yuniesky again does the obvious thing and takes the knight with his pawn. And now Carlsen, rather than take back, pushes a pawn up to e4 with a crafty discovered attack on the queen. Yuniesky here has no choice but to move his queen off the h-file, as it's now under threat by both of the bishops of Magnus, so the queen retreats back to g7. And without hesitation, Magnus Carlsen sweeps up the now unprotected bishop with his rook. Now, Yuniesky takes a few seconds to regroup here and then takes the opportunity to centralize his knight, capturing the hanging pawn and also threatening the bishop on f3. Carlsen checks with that same bishop, and Yuniesky decides to move his knight into g6 to block it. Carlsen then repositions his rook to h3, keeping it active, and then Yuniesky slams his rook to d8, threatening Carlsen's queen and taking dominance over that d file. Around 5 seconds later, we see Carlsen move his queen to g1, now with a diagonal eye on the pawn on a7. Yuniesky then takes around 10 seconds of thinking time to consider this next move and plays rook to g8, confidently abandoning any desire to castle during this game. The kings are in play for both of them. Okay, so Carlsen goes ahead and captures that pawn on a7, but note, this has now taken his queen out of the main action defensively around his king. Yuniesky shifts his queen across to d7, eyeing a very strong check attack with the queen down on d1. So Carlsen develops his bishop to e3, whilst also opening up his rook to defend and prevent Yuniesky's queen from hitting that d1 square. So Yuniesky decides to start a new attack with his queen by moving it one diagonal square up to c6, now attacking the central pawn on e4, and also attacking that free pawn down on c2. So now Carlsen, aware of the impending pressure and also the remaining time on the clock, offers up an exchange by pulling his queen back to c5. But Yuniesky rejects this. He rejects the offer and grabs the pawn on e4 instead. So Carlsen finally gets his rook involved with g1, still massively on the ropes, But, brace yourselves for a pendulum swing in momentum over the next couple of moves. Keep your eyes on the power bar, people. Yuniesky moves his king to d7, and just like that, he's now in a severely losing position if, and only if, Magnus had played the right follow-up move. But Magnus played, and keep your eye on the power bar again. Magnus played this. King to f2, throwing himself right back on the ropes according to the engine. What he should have done, what he should have played, if I go back one step and turn the board grey, what Magnus should have done is simply take the knight on g6 with his bishop, and this is killer because bam, there's a diagonal attack on the queen, and note the queen can't take because of his rooks. So you might think, well, why can't Yuniesky just take the bishop with his rook? Well, some of you might have noticed that the white rook is now open on the h file to capture the pawn on d7 check, which is the crux of why this would have been so good if Carlsen had taken this route. Allowing the rook to take that pawn would ultimately lead to checkmate, as the rook would have proceeded to work with the queen. That didn't happen, so let's get back to living color and see what actually happened. Again, Carlsen actually moved his king to f2, and then we see Yuniesky get his king back to c8. With about 11 seconds left on the clock, Carlsen doubles his rooks on the g-file, applying pressure, and then Yuniesky's knight leaps in aggressively to f4 with a seemingly suspect move, inviting Carlsen to go ahead and take the rook on g8. Carlsen obliges, and so then, take a few seconds to see if you can work out what happens next, what Yuniesky did next. Yuniesky's knights join forces to win the queen. Watch this. Knight to d3, check. Carlsen, with 8 seconds on the clock, takes with his pawn, but then Yuniesky checks again with the other knight, maintaining the momentum, and finally goes in to capture the queen. With around 4 seconds left on the clock now, Carlsen, he moves his bishop back to f3, hoping to consolidate his position. Yuniesky responds with queen to c2, a check that forces Carlsen's king back to the first rank. So the king goes back to f1, and then Yuniesky's knight moves into d3, creating multiple threats against Carlsen's position. Carlsen decides to exchange rooks. Yuniesky recaptures with his king. Carlsen then throws down with a desperate check with rook to g8, but Yuniesky easily sidesteps with his king to d7. Carlsen comes in again with another check with rook to g7, but Yuniesky simply moves his king to d6, further escaping the checks and preparing to consolidate his advantage. Carlsen now desperately repositions his rook to g8 with hope of defending the board and the clock, so Yuniesky delivers a check with queen to b1, further harassing Carlsen's king and maintaining control. And with just milliseconds left, Carlsen tries to get up off the canvas with king to e2. But it's over, my friends. It's over. Yuniesky moves his knight back and is victorious. Magnus's clock is wiped out. Okay, thanks for watching. Go ahead and check the next video that's up on the screen, and I'll see you over there.